Hello and a very warm welcome to the brand new edition of To The Point. I'm Kriti Mishra, and on today's show, my guest is Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, Mr. K.V. Subramanian. Mr. Subramanian, welcome to RSTV Television, and thank you so much for joining us through this virtual platform.
My pleasure.
You have got a lot of questions to answer, but first and foremost, of course, the GDP. Now, the GDP has slid down due to COVID-19 pandemic-induced lockdown. We understand that this is a global phenomenon, a global contraction of economy. What is your big picture view on the economy, and what's the revival plan? What extraordinary measures should the government take in the near future to revive confidence in the economy?
Firstly, Kriti, I think it's important to understand, as you said, this is a severe exogenous shock that originates from a pandemic. So the economic effects that we are seeing actually originate from a pandemic. And in this aspect, it is different. This crisis is different from what we have seen, whether it's the Asian financial crisis or the global financial crisis, which originated primarily from economic factors. This is, from a pandemic that requires social distancing, and the uncertainty is on the health front, which is then having its impact on the economy. Now, with that context, if you actually look at the GDP decline that happened for India in Q1 and relate it to the intensity of the lockdown, because globally all countries were in a lockdown during the months of April and May, with the intensity of lockdown being different across different countries. India, of course, had the most intense lockdown. When you relate it and sort of have a line of fit, it's very clear that India's GDP decline, in Q1 is primarily because of the intensity of the lockdown, because, there were large number of economic activities that were restricted, and as a result, there was obviously, going to be an impact. Second point, which is important to remember, is that this is therefore, caused primarily by the pandemic. It's not reflective of any fundamentals or either the the economic performance before the pandemic. There are some commentators who have basically tried to push this narrative that the Q1 decline is because of the of the economy, the way it was, that was slowing down the economy in earlier quarters. I think it's very important to look at the data here. If you look at the Google mobility data, it shows that in the month of March, mobility was about 20% down, even though we started lockdown only the last week of March compared to January and February. And when you look at several high frequency indicators, the index of industrial production, the 8 core sectors, cement, steel production, electricity generation, exports, all those in the month of February, where for the first time in 7 months after July 2019, were all in positive territory in terms of the growth rates, and they were actually at their peak. Also, the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, which signals future activity, had really peaked, with the service sector PMI being 58, so nearing 60%. So, in some sense, the COVID pandemic struck possibly at the most inopportune moment, when the economy, many of the indicators were trending up nicely. So it's important to keep in mind, therefore, that the Q4 growth rate would have been far higher if March was not impacted, because March, as the last month of the financial year, there is a lot of economic activity that happens. So that's the other observation that is important to keep in mind.
You often said that V-shaped recovery is visible in various sectors. I'd like to take a cue from you and say that this is a severe exogenous shock, an uncharted territory where international multilateral institutions are predicting a very bleak outlook for countries across the globe, not just for India. So what are the things that could go in favor for our country?
So, firstly, I think, Kriti, you are absolutely right. If you look at the World Economic Outlook, they have mentioned that if you look at the number of countries where the GDP per capita is going to shrink, that number is the largest in 150 years. So this is a once in a 1.5 centuries kind of event. So that's the nature of the exogenous shock and severity of that shock that all of us across the world are living through. I think that perspective is very important to keep in mind. Now, on the what are the salient points that will help recovery? I will definitely comment on that. Before that, let me just give you a couple of data points on the recovery itself. If you look at the manufacturing sector, again, if you look at the high frequency indicators, look at e-way bills, for instance, and all the comparisons I'm going to do are going to be to the 1 year back, so that it's not affected by seasonality. So if you look at e-way bills, they are 98% in August of what they were 1 year back. So now some people basically are wondering why is that not showing up in the GST data? If the e-way bills, which maybe GST revenue should have been 98% as well of last year, that's because there has been a moratorium. The companies have been provided some grace period to file their GST returns, which of course will impact actually and create this wedge between what you're seeing in the e-way bills and not necessarily reflected in the GST revenues. Similarly, if you look at again cement and steel production, you look at the railway freight, which is a very important indicator. Railway freight is 6% higher this month of August compared to last year. And if you look at the manufacturing sector PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, for the first time it is in expansionary phase at 52. For over several months. After the month of February, it's actually for the first time come in an expansionary phase. So clearly, these are good signs on the manufacturing side. I think on the services side, especially on those which are affected the most by social distancing, there continues to be some uncertainty for sure. Because of the need for social distancing, travel, tourism, those will have to. Will be affected by the pandemic. Now, what are the redeeming features? I think if you look at the digital economy, the digital transactions, for instance, have grown, are 198% in the month of August compared to last year. So it's almost double. And I think here's where India's emphasis on digitizing the economy a lot more compared to other economies is really positioning us better, because COVID is a shock that will really help the digital economy a lot more. And those that don't require physical interaction, like physical giving of cash and taking of cash, just electronic transactions, digital transactions. So clearly, the shock that is that is due to COVID, India is positioned better to really benefit from that because of the investments we've made in digitizing the economy. I would also say among the countries that came up with COVID packages, India was the only country to also implement reforms. The reforms in agriculture, reforms on labor laws that are being done, reforms on MSMEs, the definition, enabling them to grow, reforms on the private sector, the privatizing, the intent to except for couple of strategic sectors, every other non-strategic sector the government will get out. So these are all very important reforms that will enable productivity in the economy, so which will bring back productivity. I'll end with one observation, Kriti. In times like these, there is often a tendency to get pessimistic. I will remind our viewers about 3 years, 2000, 2001 and 2002, when the Indian economy recorded growths of 3.8%, 4.8% and 3.8% respectively. In other words, for 12 quarters, the Indian economy was growing at about 4%. Now, after that, this was due to the Asian financial crisis. We did three things primarily. We invested in infrastructure. The golden quadrilateral was built at that time. A lot of reforms were done. For instance, the small scale sector liberalization happened at that time. And we did a lot of disinvestment, enabled the private sector to really participate in the economy. And these three together created the 8% plus growth rates that we had till the global financial crisis hit us. So there is important lessons. India has been there, in crisis periods like this, and has done the right thing to get into again a high growth path. So I have no doubt we can do it again because we've been there and done it.
All right, fingers crossed for that. But we also saw the supplementary demands for grants for 2020-21 in Parliament. Now, India's fiscal deficit has already breached full year target in 4 months. Does that worry you?
See, extraordinary times like these, the evaluations cannot be using normal measures. These are extraordinary times, and one of the key things that has to happen during an extraordinary time when you have consumption and investment declining significantly. In the Indian economy, by the way, consumption and investment together account for close to 85%, maybe even more of the overall contribution to GDP. And this comes from the private sector. Now, therefore, there is clearly a role for the government to step in because private sector, will be more risk averse. And so the government has to step in times like these. So there will be an increase in the fiscal deficit. But when you look at the evidence, and I was mentioning about the Asian financial crisis period, because of the decline in growth for 3 years, our debt to GDP increased significantly. In fact, till now, if you see historically, our high has been 87% in terms of the debt to GDP, the government debt to GDP. General government debt to GDP, and that happened during the Asian financial crisis. Despite that, we actually did the fiscal spend, and that's what brought growth back. So there are important lessons there which we actually need to take into account now. That times like these, the focus has to be on growth and not as much on on fiscal spending, because once you get growth, you actually get debt sustainability as well, because the debt to GDP ratio has GDP in the denominator. And when you have GDP growth happening, the denominator grows and the debt to GDP ratio comes back. So this is a very important lesson that we have to keep in mind.
I completely take your point that we have to push growth, we have to push aggregate demand. There's prodding by the government as well. There are incentives by the banks as well. But are banks not lending enough, or the industry is not investing enough? What is it?
See, on the banking sector, Kriti, I think this period is a fantastic opportunity for the banking sector to leapfrog by investing in technology, data, data analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, because that's what the financial sector across the world is doing. I'll give you an example from sport. If there is this chess software that was built using artificial intelligence, Deep Blue, which defeated the highest ELO rated player ever in the world in the history of mankind, Garry Kasparov, and that an AI built software defeated. Compared to the tactics, strategy, and design that is possible in chess, which is far more complicated than default. If AI can actually defeat a chess grandmaster and the highest ever, then AI data analytics can easily defeat default as well. What our bankers, both public and private sector bankers, need to realize is this opportunity build on technology, and that is where really the next wave is going to come, because they can create scale in the banking sector, give credit at significant levels without having the problem of NPAs by using technology, and evidence clearly shows that. So what is required here is a change in mindset. I'm going to use the parallel of cricket teams in India. If you look at the 1990s cricket team, that was known for winning very well in India, but had nothing noteworthy to show when it went outside. The Indian banking sector today is like the 1990s cricket team. Instead, they should be taking the mindset of the cricket team led by Sourav Ganguly or Mahendra Singh Dhoni, which went and recognized itself and gained recognition all over the globe, not just basically being tigers at home. So that's the change in mindset, and that requires significant investment in technology, both public sector and private sector banks, because even private sector banks have primarily used database models only for retail lending, not for corporate lending. And this is the opportunity that the banking sector needs to grab now and thereby contribute to the economy, because the fifth largest economy in the world has only one bank in the global top 100, and that's the 55th ranked State Bank of India. countries that are fraction our size, 1/6, 1/8 our size, have 3 times, 4 times as many banks. And no economy grows without the banking sector really being large. The Chinese economy, for instance, has 18 banks in the global top 100. Japan, when it was growing in its heyday in the 1980s, of the top 25 global banks, actually large banks, 18 were Japanese. So the banking sector needs to recognize this and emulate Dhoni's cricket team or Saurav Ganguly's cricket team.
Well, those are fantastic examples that you gave. I hope the banking sector will keep that in mind. But let's shift focus towards Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now we've seen massive spending there. But Atmanirbhar Bharat will also require infrastructure spending by respective states as well. With inadequate GST collection, how effectively would the states join the ranks in the Atmanirbhar Bharat program of the government?
See, Atmanirbhar Bharat, first of all, is actually, not just about the government. It's a government, change in mindset that the government is trying to bring, in the Indian corporate sector to become Atmanirbhar. And here, actually, I want to distinguish. Atmanirbhar means, self-reliant, and that has to be distinguished from self-sufficiency. Self-reliance actually comes comes with competition, competing with the best, because self-reliance does not come without capabilities. And so, self-sufficiency is actually an insular concept where, you try to basically, it's like the island economy or Robinson Crusoe. That's the kind of, metaphor that you would use for self-sufficiency. But self-reliance is actually one which comes from competition, which then builds capability. So that's the key, mindset that needs to be, thought about. And here I will use the example of the Indian FMCG sector, the fast-moving consumer goods, where, it's only in India and some of the Southeast Asian economies that you go to the hinterland, you will actually get Dove shampoo or, Navaratna Tel, for instance, in these sachets, which basically is, people like us buy in these bottles, but, they're also available in sachets. The lesson there is that the price point has been created in such a way that people at the bottom of the pyramid can also avail it. And that's the opportunity that the Indian corporate sector needs to really avail, because there is huge demand at the bottom of the pyramid. So our corporates need to actually think about playing the volume game, because at the bottom of the pyramid, you have to play the volume game. When you cater to the top of the pyramid, you can play the margin game. But the margin game is not going to enable you to cater to the huge demand that is out there at the bottom of the pyramid. Something that Dr. C.K. Prahlad actually has written about for the last 20 years, and I think something that again the Indian corporate sector needs to grab. Now, with respect to your specific question on state spending, see, I have 2 points to make here. First, when from the perspective of the economy, what we need is spending. Whether it's the spending, when I go to spend, if I give money with my left hand or I give money with my right hand, it is still spending. So, from the perspective of the economy, what we really need is spending, number one. Number two, if you look at the data for the, many states, they have still not exhausted their borrowing limits. There is still sufficient cushion for them to be able to borrow and thereby spend as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, the states also need to remember that when they get growth, debt sustainability also comes. So, that change in, the direction of causality is something they need to imbibe as well.
Right, and before we end this conversation, now the KV Kamath Committee has recommended 5 financial ratios for 26 sectors for lenders to consider while finalizing the resolution plans. What would be the impact? What do you foresee?
No, I think, in times like these, debt restructuring is important, because, clearly this is an exogenous shock, which affects the demand that, that companies face, and therefore, there will be an impact on their cash flows and thereby their ability to service debt. So, one has to be practical about this. Because if and what companies also face is a problem that we economists call debt overhang, which is if debt is not restructured, then they will not be able to make even investments that are profitable. And debt restructuring can enable such investments. So it's this is something that is both practical and from a conceptual perspective, economically, from the economic perspective, also something that is recommended at this time. Of course, what is important is that this has to be a temporary measure. The lesson that we have from the 2008 episode is that the restructuring should not be continued forever. The restructured assets that was created, ended up becoming an excuse for taking non-performing assets and putting it as restructured assets. So that is something that we have to keep in mind and avoid that particular mistake that was made. But restructuring is something that is required and is I think it's a good move that the central bank has indeed appointed an independent committee to actually recommend these. And the good thing also that that the Kamath-led committee has done is kept it simple, just based on 5 indicators, which will enable the implementation of this. I think the only lesson is to make sure there will inevitably be pressure later to say, okay, continue this more, continue this longer. I think that pressure should be resisted once the pandemic is over. I think then we basically must get back to the provisioning norms and the and the usual norms for labeling NPAs, etc., SMA, NPAs, etc. We should be getting back to that. That's the key lesson we have to keep remembering.
And lastly, Mr. Subramanian, anything else that the government needs to do on the front of ease of doing business? In addition to, of course, what the government has been doing.
Yes, government has indeed actually been focusing on this issue significantly, and in fact, since 2014, there has been a lot of focus,
yes.
And that is why you've seen this, India's EODP ranking in the World Bank rankings improve from about 120 plus to actually coming in the 60s. But this is an ongoing effort. I think one of the key things that needs to be done is to, and which is, government is already at it, is the labour laws. The code on wages has already been passed by Parliament. 3 other codes actually are being tabled in Parliament now. What this will do is, especially on the labour employer-employee relations, because we had close to 50 odd acts and regulations, which basically created a compliance burden, because definitions like salaries, wages, bonus, etc. used to be defined in multiple ways across these acts, and created a nightmare for private parties to interpret these, and that created difficulty in compliance. Now, by rationalizing them in the as part of these 4 codes, and also making important changes in the labour laws itself, thereby enabling flexibility in hiring, I think industry will really be benefited from it. Even the changes on the tax side, honoring the honest taxpayer, using faceless assessment, those are important steps to ease the compliance burden for corporates. So I think this is an effort that the government is very serious about and is working on. In particular, the Meghli, for instance, is working very diligently on this aspect.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for that erudite conversation, and we do hope that the resilience of Indian economy that will be showcased in the next quarter. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Kriti.